From Cambridge University Press and in collaboration with The Naked Scientists, this is episode 8 of the Cambridge Prisms podcast, addressing real-world challenges in research and discovery. I'm Chris Smith. This month, were the dinosaurs already dying out when the impact came, or did it do for a formerly thriving community? Also, why drylands are set to experience their moment in the spotlight, and why we're so vulnerable to droughts. But first, to genetics and the diversity of humankind. The diseases that we succumb to are frequently the product of the interaction between the environment we inhabit and the genes that drive our biochemistry. So two people can live side by side in the same place, eating the same food and doing the same jobs, yet have totally different disease risks. But before we can provide tailor-made interventions specific to a person's makeup, we need to know what the disease associations are. And we're beginning to get there. Biobanks are collecting epidemiological, clinical and genetic data, allowing us to link genes to disease and environmental risks. But many of these archives are centred on quite narrow slices of the human population, which can limit their utility to certain populations and means that many genetic variants and their attendant protective or deleterious influences never get uncovered. Bana Alamad at the University of Oxford has been looking at the role that diversity plays in our aspiring vision for personalised medicine.
We hear the term personalised medicine a lot, and we know that understanding genetic information can really help us realise this dream of medicine becoming personalised and tailored specifically for the benefit of individual patients. And when we started thinking about this review, we really wanted to look within the immune-related disease space and really propose what we think the challenges we're going to face and we are facing are, but also suggest the essential direction that the field of genomics needs to head in order to actually realize this dream of personalized medicine.
Now, if you and I had been chatting maybe a decade ago, the conversation would probably have dwelled really heavily on the cost. But now the cost of doing genetic analysis has gone straight through the floor, hasn't it? It's a fraction of what we were spending when we did, for instance, the Human Genome Project. So what does the problem or the kind of obstruction, the obstacle, what does it now look like for doing projects like this? Where are the bottlenecks?
Completely true. So as you mentioned, high throughput genetic sequencing is so cheap now in comparison to where it's been. It's really revolutionizing our ability to identify genetic variation between population in the context of disease. And this is why our field is really very fast-paced, I would say. But I think there are key challenges and key areas that we really need to think about. And the first thing is to really think about the interplay between genetic information and environmental factors and how this interplay affects determining the risk of susceptibility to immune disease. The second really important thing is considering genetic variation across diverse populations, not just including everyone for the sake of diversity, but because it's super important to help us understand disease etiology and what different variants can mean and how they can lead to diseases and so on. So I'd say these are my top two.
So if we just focus on one very homogeneous population, which you tend to get in, say, a Western country, there are very likely going to be populations in many other geographies facing the exigencies of the environment there, lifestyle there, which may well mean there are some interesting genetic forms that would otherwise escape and may give us insights into all new kinds of mechanisms of disease or even disease treatment. Is that what you're saying by that diversity point?
Yes. But I'm also saying that currently we have limited clinical utility when it comes to genetic-based diagnosis and risk susceptibility and so on in these non-Caucasian populations. Really studying all of this variation in these specific populations can really help us highlight and understand mechanisms and the way disease progresses, that we won't be able to do that if we keep only studying homogeneous population.
What's your solution to achieving that then? What do you think we should do? Should big charities or research fund sources or even governments of many of these countries just put up huge amounts of money then and say, right, we're going to start genetically sequencing a good cross-section of our populations so that we end up with a full database?
Well, that's one option. So I think large-scale biobanks that are dedicated to populations, to different, various, diverse populations, is crucial because you need to have an understanding of as much variation as you could capture, which means that we can identify variation that is common and also extremely, extremely rare. But I also think beyond that, if we really want to think about what we want and where our field should head, we need to think about capacity building because I can't just go and sequence, say, X population because they are different and they are understudied without thinking about capacity building and designing and implementing research that is up to standard with these international methods that we're using. So it's beyond the data, in my opinion. It's more about capacity building, setting up infrastructure, and also representation.
Some people will turn around and they'll say, well, resources are limited. It all comes down to money. The world could always use more of it, and there's only therefore so many things we can spend it on. Is this the best thing we can spend the resources on right now? Or should we focus on putting fires out and worry about tarting up the buildings later? Because this is very much a capacity building thing. It is not an instant fix.
Mm. I think this is a very good point. In general, medicine has always been very reactive. Someone gets sick, and then it takes us time to diagnose that. It takes us time and resources to go through understanding the prognosis, and it takes us time to figure out the proper treatment. And this is very expensive. So if we want to use the money argument, I would say that it's extremely expensive to treat someone who has advanced stage of disease, especially when you think about many, many people and you think about a very wide, large scale. So I think through investing in proper infrastructure and then key targeted genetic approaches, we can really start improving this case and really shifting towards this concept of personalized medicine. And I think on the long run, this is going to save us money.
It's a compelling argument, isn't it? Bana Alamad there. One of the best documented mass extinction events in our planet's history happened about 66 million years ago when a town-sized asteroid doing about 20 kilometres a second slammed into what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. The ensuing dust cloud blocked out the sun for years and it plunged the planet into the equivalent of a nuclear winter, changing the climate, halting plant growth and toppling the food chain. With the exception of their bird descendants, dinosaurs disappear completely from the fossil record at this point, suggesting that the impact was linked to their demise. But was this the cataclysm that wiped out a formerly thriving population, or were they already on shaky ground by the time this happened, and it was merely the final straw that broke the Camarasaurus's back? Bethany Allen is grappling with this big question at ETH Zurich.
If dinosaurs were already declining before this time, maybe it doesn't matter that the asteroid struck, they would have gone extinct anyway. But actually, if they were still diversifying and we were getting lots more dinosaurs at this time, potentially, if that asteroid hadn't struck, then that group could have still been around, maybe even today. I wanted to look at this question in a bit more detail using some new methods that have not been applied to this question before to see if we could actually figure this out.
So what would you look for then as the sort of giveaway that either they were still diversifying and therefore still flourishing, or conversely, they were in decline by the time that mass impact happened?
The approach that we used was to try and model the evolutionary process that describes how many different types of dinosaurs that we had immediately before this mass extinction event. And in order to do that, we set up these models to describe the major processes underneath evolution, which are origination, so this process where species divide and become multiple other species, and then compared that with extinction when we lose species. So when we have more origination, where we have species diversifying, if that's higher than the number of extinctions that we're having, then we know that dinosaurs were still diversifying. But conversely, if we're seeing more extinction, then dinosaurs were in decline and might eventually have become completely extinct.
Does the rate at which and the fact they are diversifying, does that say that things are good or does it say that things are bad? Because you could argue if they're under really severe pressure, there's a driver to diversify.
Absolutely. And that's a great question that a lot of people are really interested in investigating in more detail, because often what we think happens when speciation takes place is that there will be one population of dinosaurs, and for some reason that population splits. And that's the process that kind of precedes this speciation event. And that can happen because dinosaurs in this population choose to eat different things, or they choose to mate with some other dinosaurs but not others, and this can lead to a split in the population. So this can create more diversity, but then also when this population divides, the total population size is split between the two, and this can also create some extinction risk if these population sizes become too small. So it can be quite a difficult time in evolution.
How did you get at this then? And what did you actually find when you started to piece it together in this way? What seems to be the picture that emerges?
We know that the main piece of evidence that we have for understanding how much dinosaur diversity we had was the fossil record. So we have these fossils, we can identify them and count the number of different species that we think that we had during the Cretaceous in the lead up to this mass extinction event. However, we know also that the fossil record is incredibly incomplete. Only a tiny fraction of all of the animals that have ever been alive in Earth history actually make it into the fossil record. And so we use two different evolutionary models. In one of the models, the fossil record as we see it was treated as a series of fossilization events. So each fossil that we included in our model was treated as independent. And then in the other model, instead, we treated the fossil record as one big process. And this enabled us to look at fossilization as a rate. Our intention was that between these two models, we would be able to see the impact of how we can actually view the fossil record on what we estimated dinosaur diversity to be. And actually what we found was that these two models came out with completely different results. So when we think about the fossil record as a series of individual fossils, we estimated that dinosaurs were probably already in decline before the end Cretaceous, perhaps only by a small amount, but there was more extinction than speciation. However, when we think about the fossil record as a process, as a rate of the number of samples of dinosaurs that we have through time, instead, we estimated much more uncertainty in the number of species that we had in the end of the Cretaceous, but actually this number was probably still growing and that dinosaurs were still speciating and diversifying.
Where does this leave us then, Bethany? Because it seems that while it's insightful what you've found, it doesn't actually answer our question. It creates more uncertainty, not less.
Absolutely. And it seems somewhat dissatisfying that our major result is we don't know, but we're hoping that actually the fact that we have mechanisms behind these two models that we can now point to and say, this is the root of the problem. And hopefully that means that going forwards, there's more that we can learn about dinosaur evolution. I think one thing that we definitely did reveal is the fact that how we view the fossil record is incredibly important. And that means that actually the more that we can understand about the processes that create fossils, and also the more fossils that we can discover and add to the amount of information that we have, hopefully that will mean that in the future we can really get to the bottom of this problem.
I suppose, nevertheless, it also does keep both theories in play, doesn't it? Which means we keep on thinking, we keep asking questions. But what could be the mechanism if it wasn't just the giant impact that did for the dinosaurs? What other mechanisms ahead of that could also account for a decline, if there already was one?
So there have already been some studies that have been published talking about potential changes in climate that were happening around this time. And there has been a suggestion that perhaps this meant that the particular types of environments that dinosaurs were living in were becoming less common. And when there is less area for these dinosaurs to live in, this forces the population sizes to shrink and can ultimately lead to extinction.
So it is still a mystery. Bethany Allen there. This is the Cambridge Prisms podcast, and I'm Chris Smith. In a minute, despite being a nation known for its farming and being the origin of the agrarian revolution back in history, why Britain is potentially so vulnerable to future impacts of drought. Before that, though, Sasha Reid from the US Geological Survey and Andrew Feldman from the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center are working on an exciting new initiative that aims to build momentum around a formerly neglected but crucial sector of science and the environment.
This initiative is all about bringing drylands, deserts, and other dry ecosystems to the forefront of science. We really want to blend how we understand systems with satellites and models and on-the-ground measurements, airplanes, all together to try to understand complex dryland ecosystems.
But why don't we understand them already, Andrew?
They're very heterogeneous. If you go to a desert and you look out and about and you move 1 meter to the right, 1 meter to the left, things can change quite rapidly. Different plants, different types of animals, different amounts of moisture that's available. And they're very vulnerable to climate. They're very vulnerable to weather, large and very intense heat waves and droughts and even floods. So they're quite vulnerable to these extreme climate events.
But why, Sasha, have we suddenly decided this is a priority now?
Drylands historically haven't received the same attention for us because if we close our eyes, I say picture a desert, most of us will picture blowing sand dunes, maybe there's a camel in the background, but we don't see a lot of life. But drylands actually have lots of life. And so because we've perceived them as desert wastelands, we haven't studied them in the same way we've studied wetter ecosystems. We've assumed they're not important. But we're realizing drylands are incredibly important to our species and other species. They provide 60% of our food. They represent huge portions of the carbon cycle, which regulates our climate. Drylands are crazy important, and we're just starting to get into that a lot more. And so now is the time to be able to bring a lot of these new tools we have for studying, as Andrew said, heterogeneous, variable ecosystems in ways that we just couldn't before. So it's kind of the joining of a evolution of our realizing how important they are with the evolution of the tools that we need to understand these really complicated ecosystems.
Who are the big players in this then?
NASA is a huge player in this. So NASA really has the ability, and NASA's terrestrial ecology program has the ability to bring together the diverse skills and tools and expertise needed to do this dramatic advance of understanding and predicting and making decisions for drylands. So NASA is the lead of this and has charged Andrew and I and the rest of our crack team of scientists and dryland decision makers to try to put together a plan for how we would use all of these different tools to better understand drylands.
How's it going to work then, Andrew? Are you basically going to commission studies or fund studies or guide where funding should go, where the exploration needs to turn its attention in order to solve a lot of these unknowns that we've hitherto overlooked?
The first step for us right now is we're in the planning phase. So we've written a big document that gives the agenda for what the science community, what the practitioner communities and land managers should focus on. And then if it's selected to go forward, there's several ways in which funding can be distributed, but a lot of it is going to be competed through proposals. So scientists and land managers could write proposals to this NASA program to get pretty large amounts of money to do 3-4 year studies. And then there's also directed parts of the missions. NASA program managers might direct aircraft or field collection campaigns that might be varying in the amount of money they give over, I'd say 7 to 10 years.
You've said the M word. So how much actually funding is being put up? I mean, is this a realistic amount of money? Because if it's the problem you're saying it is, which is just many, many decades of underinvestment, underinvestigation, many unknowns, this is going to take a lot of resource.
We haven't been given a budget, which has actually made this very challenging to plan for. So we've had to kind of think of different levels of involvement of the community, smaller scale up to larger scale. But we know from the last mission that was an Arctic Boreal campaign that NASA ran since 2010 or so up to now, that was about $100 million we've found, and maybe a little bit more than that. So we're anticipating maybe a similar level. That's not very much though, is it, Sasha? Because if you look at what Congress gave long COVID about a year ago, that was measured in the billions, and you're talking about just $100 million. I mean, that's actually small beer.
I definitely think billions would be a great budget for us to be able to work with on a dryland science, but having $100 or more million is still pretty good and would allow us to engage the community. As Andrew said, it's not us who will get the money if the adaptation and response in drylands program was moved forward, ARID, it would be the research community. And as Andrew said, being able to do science for 10 years or more is part of the power too. So part of it is the funding, but part of it is the length of time. It gives a decade-long view of coordinated research that really lets scientists sink their teeth into these heavy questions about how these ecosystems are working.
You talk about community and you also talk about time. Really, two things spring to mind. One is that if you've got time, you can grow a community because you can invest upstream in people that aren't even at university yet, can't you? So you can have a plan for the future, but have you got enough pairs of hands who can actually really kickstart this? Is the science, if it has been underinvested in previously, has it got the pairs of hands that you will need to get this going at the sort of scale that it sounds like you want to see it delivering on?
Great question. Yes, we totally have the hands. There is so much interest and engagement in drylands right now. I feel like drylands are having a moment. And one of the things that is really cool about these terrestrial ecology field campaigns, as you say, is that people can be in them for whole big parts of their careers. And in the Arctic and Boreal experiment above, the one that's currently ending for NASA, there are people who are principal investigators now who started as grad students, then they were postdoctoral fellows, then they were early career scientists and moving through the pipeline all under that umbrella of the field campaign. And so we think there are so many useful hands right now, and it's part of why now feels like a fantastic time to have a drylands focused campaign.
Andrew, America's about to get a new president and NASA is going to get a new boss, isn't it? So is that going to affect any of this?
We don't know. I think there's an interaction between, what the president's priorities are, what the next lead of NASA, and then what Congress does. These things have to go through Congress, and it's very unclear to us how Congress will handle this. I will say this campaign is actually set up in a pretty bipartisan manner, in that big chunk of our campaign is in Western US. It's kind of written by the people for the people. We've included ranchers, farmers, tribal communities, research communities in the scoping that we've done. We're focusing on ranching, farming, not only just discovering how science works and how things work in drylands, how plants respond to the environment, but also how can we better do cattle ranching? And what are the best plants? How do plants respond to the environment that cattle eat? And how do they survive? This kind of comes down to the fundamental things we're going to work on here.
And we will watch with interest. Andrew Feldman and Sasha Reed there. Now, talking of dry lands, climate change. Climate change predictions all seem to agree that one common manifestation is a likely intensification of weather extremes, which will include flooding, and we've seen plenty of that recently in Europe, as well as its counterpart, drought. And recent drought episodes both in Europe, but particularly in the UK, have helped to highlight the vulnerability of our agricultural and horticultural sectors. And this is largely because most of our production is rain-fed, and it depends entirely on, as Cranfield University's Ian Holman dubs it, the capricious nature of summer rainfall. He's been looking at the main knowledge gaps which need to be addressed to shore up the system.
First and foremost, we don't actually know in economic terms how drought impacts agriculture. There's lots of anecdotal values bandied around, but because agriculture is so diverse that every drought is different, affecting different parts of the country, and agriculture itself is very dynamic with different crop rotations, etc., that it's quite a challenge to understand what the economic impacts are. And obviously money talks. If it's developing or creating large financial losses, then there's more of an emphasis for both the businesses and the government and regulators to support the industry.
Is this a bit like when you talk to a conservationist and they say you can't conserve something without understanding it in the first place? Are you saying we can't mitigate against this if we don't understand the impacts in the first place?
Yes, I think it's an important element. You've got to have the evidence base to say, actually, this is a problem. Farmers know it's a problem because it's impacting them severely. But in terms of then how the whole supply chain, how organizations like the Environment Agency respond, they need that evidence base to support those sort of business decisions.
So, how should we go about it?
It comes back to both the quality gathering of data. If we think about the irrigated agricultural sector, which sort of provides much of our fresh vegetables and soft fruits, for example, we haven't collected data on irrigated areas, numbers of farm reservoirs, irrigation methods in a structured way for about 10 years. So activities that are regularly done, like agricultural censuses, need to better capture the data that is relevant for helping us understand the vulnerability to drought.
What about longitudinally as well? Because a lot of the time when we look at things, we see the short, sharp shock, the acute effect, but there are often spillover or knock-on effects in years downstream, whether that's because you erode the crop base, you change the soil in some way so it's more vulnerable in subsequent years. There must be so many moving parts that this probably is quite difficult to do.
Absolutely. And it is a challenge with drought that a lot of the impacts or consequences of the drought appear after the drought has ended. It could be the harvest, it could be the availability of feed for the livestock to get them through the winter. And so that delayed effect, when the reality of the drought has left the public imagination or the public memory and other issues have come to the fore, really does, I think, diminish the attention that is paid to that recovery phase of drought. And that's going to become more important because with the changing climate, we do expect droughts like floods to become more frequent in the future.
It really surprises me what you're saying, because we really have a track record, even back to the Middle Ages, of being notorious bureaucrats in the UK, especially with agriculture. I was talking to a medieval economist the other day who was showing me records of documenting how many pigs a person who was a peasant who lived on a landholding had. Yet here we are in this era with data for almost everything coming out of our ears, and we don't know these fundamentals, which are really crucial to our future.
The devil is always in the detail, isn't it, as to what you actually measure. As you say, we have fantastic information on sort of crop areas and livestock numbers, but the detail in that, and as you say, the longer term performance of farm businesses. Usually when there is a drought, the government comes together with a drought working group with the sector. But I think the limitation is that's often quite sort of crisis driven. It's reactive rather than proactive. And really what we need are strategies that go right from the farm level through the food supply chain to the supermarkets, to the government, to the regulators. Too often, the sort of the responses to drought are either left to the farmers, or that there isn't an appropriate risk sharing through the food supply chain.
Presumably this also is an international problem, because if we have a drought in one place, you're likely to have adverse weather elsewhere. And if you just assume, well, it's okay, we'll buy our food from somewhere else, well, everyone else is going to be doing the same thing, aren't they? So it could mean that your safeguard, your life belt, is actually already accounted for.
Yeah, I mean, the UK has sort of, we're 60% or so self-sufficient. So 40% of our food comes from overseas, and for some elements like fruit, it's even higher. Now we have at one level created resilience to drought in our supply chains by the fact that, as you say, the supermarkets import from many different countries. But there is that concern that if drought strikes our major import areas, that sort of concurrently or several of them, that will affect our food security. And occasionally we have seen that in recent years with shortages of particular fresh vegetables in our supermarkets. But we also, in our sort of domestic domestic sort of agricultural area now, there's a lot of interest in raising water tables in lowland agricultural peat soils. These are the very organic, rich soils that are some of our best food producing land, particularly for vegetables. But the drainage leads to emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, if we're going to raise the water tables in those areas to reduce the UK's contribution to climate change, there is a significant risk that some of our production in those areas might be either moved to other parts of the country, so displacing some of the impacts, or even exporting the problem, removing the production into other countries with lower environmental standards.
Ian Holman there, and that's where we have to leave it for this episode. But if you would like to follow up on any of the references and the interview transcripts for the papers that we've been hearing about in this edition of the programme, do head over to nakedscientist.com/prisms, where you can also find out how to subscribe to this podcast on the off chance that you don't already. And if you've got some science to publish, why not send it to the journals today, and perhaps you could become our next guest here on the Cambridge Prisms podcast. I'm Chris Smith from The Naked Scientist. Thanks for listening. Have a lovely Christmas and New Year in the meantime. And until then, goodbye.